In Kingston, New York, a quiet tech repair shop owner was about to unleash 20 years of buried family secrets. What started as an ordinary dinner party humiliation took a shocking turn when they came face to face with evidence of their father's criminal empire. Elijah Monroe wasn't your typical disappointed son. For 3 years he had spent his life building Monroe Tech Solutions from nothing, known for his methodical precision and quiet resilience in the face of constant mockery. When he encountered forged loan documents bearing his own signature, he had no idea he was walking into a web of identity theft, tax fraud, and systematic tenant exploitation. Elijah's decision to nod silently at his father's public humiliation would lead to an FBI investigation that would expose an entire network of real estate fraud. What began as a son finally standing up to an abusive father would become the complete dismantling of a criminal enterprise built on stolen identities and extorted rent payments. The tight-knit community of Kingston would never be the same after learning that their most respected landlord had been stealing from veterans, tenants, and his own family for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't even look up when he said it, just kept eating mom's overcooked pot roast while he held court at the head of the table like some dollar store patriarch. Tech repair, Frank Monroe announced to his captive audience of insurance adjusters and church deacons, is what kids do in their bedrooms. My son calls it a business. Laughter rippled around the dining room. Polite, awkward laughter that said we're here for the free meal and Maya's apple pie, not to watch you humiliate your kid. But Frank wasn't done. He never was. Elijah here thinks fixing phones and selling refurbished laptops makes him an entrepreneur. I told him, son, real men build things that last. Real estate. Property. Something you can touch. He gestured toward the framed photos of his rental properties lining the wall like military citations. Not this computer nonsense. I nodded. Actually nodded. Like I agreed with him. That's what broke something inside me. Not the insult itself, I'd heard variations of it for 3 years running. Not the audience either, though, watching Mrs. Henderson from the Methodist Church try to disappear into her mashed potatoes was a special kind of mortifying. It was the automatic, trained response of someone who'd given up fighting back. But Frank mistook my silence for surrender. He always did. You know what I told him last week? Frank continued, warming to his theme. I said, Elijah, when I was your age, I was buying my first duplex, using my hands, my back, my brain, real work. Not sitting in some strip mall waiting for teenagers to bring in cracked screens. Rena Tran shifted beside me. She'd been invited as my friend. Frank's way of pretending he cared about my social life while making sure I didn't come alone to cause trouble. But Rena knew the score. Her family had been tenants in one of Frank's properties until 5 years ago, when a convenient renovation eviction had forced them out right before Christmas. She caught my eye and gave me the slightest shake of her head. Don't engage. Not here. So I did. I just kept nodding while Frank painted me as everything wrong with my generation. Soft, entitled, content with scraps instead of building empires. The boy's got potential, Frank concluded magnanimously. But he needs to learn what real business looks like. Maybe I'll teach him about property management one of these days. Show him how a man provides for his family. Mom refilled wine glasses and smiled her practiced smile. The one that said, please don't make this work. Maya Monroe had perfected that expression over 27 years of marriage to a man who confused volume with authority. The conversation drifted to local politics and rising property taxes. Frank's guests nodded along as he explained how smart landlords navigate the system, how you had to be strategic about depreciation schedules and tenant agreements. He spoke like someone lecturing a business school, not a dining room full of people who just wanted to eat in peace. But I was listening now. Really listening. Because something he'd said earlier was bothering me. That comment about teaching me property management one of these days, like he hadn't already tried to rope me into his business when I was 22 and drowning in student loans. Just need your signature on a few forms, son. Standard stuff. Helps with the bank applications when you have family backing you up. I'd signed without reading. Trusted him because that's what sons do, right? Trust their fathers to look out for them. After the guests left and I'd helped Mom clear the dishes, I sat in my car in their driveway, scrolling through old emails on my phone, looking for those documents Frank had me sign 3 years ago. Found them buried in a folder labeled Family Business Important. Joint Business Credit Line, I'll say, partnership documents. And there, in the middle of a stack of papers I'd trusted him to handle, my name listed as cosigner on a commercial loan for $185,000, a loan I'd never seen, for a property I'd never visited. But there was my signature, notarized and everything. I sat there in the dark, engine off, staring at the screen. The house glowed warm and yellow behind me. Through the kitchen window I could see Mom washing dishes while Frank read his tablet, probably checking property listings or scrolling through Facebook posts about the good old days when men were men. My phone buzzed, text from Rena. "You okay? You looked ready to flip that table." I typed back, "Meet me at the shop tomorrow. Need help with something." What kind of help? I looked at the loan documents again, at my forged signature, at the address of a property that didn't match any of the rental houses Frank had shown me over the years. The kind where we find out what else my name is attached to. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "This is about your dad, isn't it?" "Yeah. And I think it's bigger than just tonight." I started the car and backed out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror I watched the house shrink away. For the first time in years I wasn't driving home angry. I was driving home with a plan. Rena brought coffee and a laptop. I brought 5 years' worth of tax documents, bank statements, and that growing folder of papers Frank had me sign for family business purposes. My shop, Monroe Tech Solutions, squeezed between a nail salon and a vacant storefront that used to sell vitamins, wasn't much to look at. Fluorescent lights that flickered when trucks passed outside, a workbench covered in phone parts, and a cash register I'd bought, used from a pawn shop, but it was mine, built with my own credit, my own mistakes, my own stubborn refusal to admit. Frank might be right about me. "Show me what you found," Rena said, settling into the folding chair I kept for customers who wanted to wait while I worked. I spread the loan documents across the counter. "This is my signature. But I never saw this property. And look at the date. 3 months after I supposedly agreed to it." Rena picked up the papers, scanning with the focused intensity that made her such a good accounting student. Her dark hair fell across her face as she worked, and I caught myself watching her instead of the document. We'd known each other since high school, but our friendship had deepened after her family's eviction. She understood what it felt like to be on the wrong side of Frank Monroe's business practices. "This address," she said, pointing to the loan application. "It's not one of his rental property, at least not one he's ever mentioned." That's what I thought. "So where is it?" We spent the next hour cross-referencing addresses. Rena pulled up property records while I dug through old mail I'd saved, the kind of financial paperwork I usually threw away, but had been too distracted to deal with. "Here," Rena said, pointing at her laptop screen. 127 Industrial Drive, warehouse space, purchased 18 months ago through Monroe Holdings LLC. Monroe Holdings, company name. And look who's listed as the managing partners. She turned the screen toward me. Frank Monroe, primary signatory, Elijah Monroe, secondary signatory with full financial liability. I stared at my name on the screen. "I never signed up for any LLC, but your signature's on file with the state, digital copy." She clicked through several more screens. "Along with your social security number and a copy of your driver's license." The bell above my shop door chimed. We both looked up to see Denny Harper shuffling in, his Vietnam veteran cap slightly crooked and his hands shaky from whatever medications kept him upright these days. "Elijah, you got a minute? My tablet's acting up again." "Sure, Mr. Harper. Just let me finish something." But Denny was already looking at the papers spread across my counter. His expression changed, hardened. "That's your father's handwriting," he said quietly. "You know my dad's handwriting?" Denny pulled off his cap and ran a hand through what was left of his gray hair. "Kid, I've been getting letters in that handwriting for 3 years. Every time your old man wants to raise my rent off the books." Rena and I exchanged glances. "Off the books? Sit down, Mr. Harper," Rena said gently. "Tell us what you mean." Denny lowered himself into the customer chair like his bones were made of glass. "I rent the upstairs apartment over on Elm Street. Been there 19 years. Same lease, same terms, but about 3 years ago, Frank started coming around asking for extra money. Cash money. Said it was for maintenance and improvements." "How much extra?" I asked. "Started at 50 a month. Now it's up to 200. Denny's voice was tired, defeated. I tried to refuse, but he said he'd find a reason to evict me. Sudden inspection violations, code problems. You know how it works." I did know, because I'd heard Frank brag about it. How smart landlords found ways to increase revenue without updating official lease agreements. How you had to be creative in a competitive market. I'd thought he was talking about legitimate improvement projects. "Mr. Harper," Rena said carefully, "do you have any of those letters? The ones asking for extra money?" "Every damn one, filed alphabetically in a shoebox. My wife always said, keep your paperwork, and old habits die hard." He looked between us. "Why? What's going on?" I looked at the loan documents spread across my counter. At my name, attached to properties I'd never seen, and business decisions I'd never made. "I think my father's been using my identity to secure loans, and I think he's been running an off-the-books rent scheme to help pay for them." Denny's face went pale. "Jesus, kid. How deep does this go?" Rena was already typing on her laptop. "If he's doing it to Mr. Harper, he's probably doing it to other tenants. And if he's forging signatures on business documents..." She trailed off, but I could see where her mind was going. Tax evasion. Insurance fraud. God knows what else. "Mr. Harper," I said, "would you be willing to make a statement? Official one, I mean. About the off-books rent increases." The old man looked at me for a long moment. "Your father ever tell you why he gave me such a good deal on that apartment 19 years ago?" I shook my head. "Because I caught him billing the VA for repairs he never made. Phantom invoices for veteran housing improvements. I could have turned him in, but I was younger then. Needed a place to live. So we made a deal. He'd rent to me cheap, and I'd keep my mouth shut." The shop went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator display case where I kept phone batteries. But cheap stopped being cheap when he started asking for extra. Denny continued. "And I'm too old to keep playing his games." Rena reached across the counter and touched the old man's hand. "We'll help you, Mr. Harper. All of us." I was already reaching for my phone. "Mr. Harper, I need you to go home and get those letters. Everything you have with Frank's signature. Bring them back here tomorrow." "What are you planning, kid?" I looked at the loan documents, at my forged signature, at Rena's laptop screen, showing an LLC I'd never agreed to join. "I'm planning to find out how many laws my father's broken using my name. And then I'm planning to make sure he faces consequences for every single one." Denny Harper arrived the next morning with a shoebox that looked like it had survived at least 2 floods. And a house fire. Inside, 3 years' worth of handwritten notes demanding extra rent, copies of receipts for cash payments, and the real treasure, a voice recording on an old cassette player. "Recorded it myself," Denny explained, setting the tiny device on my counter. "Frank got loud one night when I told him I couldn't afford the extra 100 that month. Said some things he probably wishes he could take back." Rena pressed play. Frank's voice filled the shop, slurred slightly but unmistakably him. "Listen, old man. You think the housing authority gives a shit about your sob story? I can have inspectors find violations in that place that'll shut you down in a week. Mold, electrical problems, whatever I need. So either you pay what I'm asking, or you find yourself explaining to your social worker why you're living in your car." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was extortion. "Jesus, Mr. Harper, why didn't you report this?" The old man shrugged. "Who was I gonna report it to? Your father knows half the city council. Goes to church with the housing director. Throws money at the police benevolent fund every Christmas. He gestured around my shop. Besides, I figured if anyone was gonna stop him, it'd be family, someone who knew him well enough to see through the community leader act. Rena had been quiet, taking notes on her laptop. Now she looked up. Elijah, we need to be smart about this. If we're going to expose him, we need everything documented proper. Chain of custody, notarized statements, legal protections for witnesses. What are you thinking? Whistleblower complaint. Anonymous, but comprehensive. Tax evasion, identity theft, tenant intimidation. The works. She pulled up a government website. There are federal protections for people who report landlord fraud, especially when it involves veterans. I thought about Frank sitting at his dinner table last night, explaining to his guests how real men build lasting businesses, how property management required strategic thinking and careful attention to regulations. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but the fraud was actionable. Mr. Harper, would you be willing to give a notarized statement about the off-books rent and the threat, if it means other tenants don't have to deal with this crap? Yeah, I'd testify in court if I had to. Rena was already making a list. We'll need everything. Financial records, lease agreements, any correspondence. We should probably document the warehouse situation too. The property he bought using your identity. Over the next week, we built a case that felt like constructing a bomb. Every document we found, every connection we traced, every lie we uncovered made the eventual explosion more devastating. Frank had been busy. The warehouse on Industrial Drive was just the beginning. We found 2 other properties purchased through Monroe Holdings LLC, all with my name attached to the liability. A boat slip at the marina that he'd somehow registered under my social security number. Even a business credit card that showed regular charges to restaurants and sporting goods stores. Personal expenses run through what was supposed to be a legitimate business entity. But the real revelation came when Rena called her contact at the county clerk's office. You're not going to believe this, she said, hanging up her phone. That warehouse, he's been collecting rental income from it for 8 months. Industrial tenant, some kind of auto parts business, but there's no record of the income on his tax filings. How much income? $4,000 a month. Cash lease according to the filing. No paper trail except the initial agreement. I did the math in my head. $32,000 in unreported rental income. At Frank's tax bracket, that was serious money owed to the IRS. There's more, Rena continued. The auto parts business, it's registered to a company called Patriot Holdings. And guess who owns Patriot Holdings? I waited. Frank Monroe. He's renting property to himself and calling it a business expense. That evening, I drove past the warehouse. It sat at the end of Industrial Drive like a gray metal monument to my father's ambition. The parking lot was empty except for Frank's truck, the same truck he'd driven to my shop 6 months ago, to explain why I needed to think bigger about my future. I sat in my car watching the building, thinking about all the dinners where he'd lectured me about building something real, about creating value that lasted, about the difference between men who made things happen and boys who waited for opportunities to fall in their laps. My phone buzzed. Text from Mom. Your father wants to know if you'd like to learn about property management. He says you might have better business sense than he thought. I stared at the message for a long time, then I typed back. Tell him I'm already learning, just not the way he expects. The next morning, Rena and I walked into the office of Collins & Associates, the law firm that specialized in whistleblower protection. Attorney Sarah Collins looked like someone who'd spent her career fighting people exactly like Frank Monroe, tired, determined, and completely unimpressed by local reputation. This is substantial, she said after reviewing our documentation. Identity theft, tax evasion, tenant intimidation. We're talking federal charges if this goes where I think it's going. What's the next step? I asked. We file complaints with the IRS, the state attorney general and the Federal Housing Authority, but once we do this, there's no controlling how far it spreads. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Denny Harper paying cash extortion to keep his home, about other tenants who might be facing the same threats, about my name attached to fraudulent business dealings I'd never consented to. I'm prepared, I said. Collins nodded. Then let's make sure your father learns the difference between building something real and building something that can withstand scrutiny. Tommy Bo Graves answered his phone on the third ring, sounding like a man who'd been awakened from a nap in his recliner, which, knowing Bo, was probably exactly what happened. Yeah? Mr. Graves, this is, well, I'd rather not give my name, but I have some information about Frank Monroe that you might want to see. Silence. Then who is someone who thinks you should know what kind of tenant you're dealing with? Frank's been using your property as collateral for loans he never disclosed. Tax liens, federal investigations. The kind of thing that could make a landlord very nervous about liability. I'd spent 3 days researching Bo Graves before making the call. 72 years old, owned 6 commercial properties around Kingston, served on the Town Planning Commission for 15 years. Conservative no-nonsense, the kind of man who believed in handshake deals and keeping your word. Also the kind of man who didn't appreciate being lied to. What kind of information? Bo's voice had sharpened. The kind that comes with documentation. I'll email you what I have. After that, what you do with it is your business. I hung up before he could ask more questions. Anonymous tips worked better when they stayed anonymous. Rena looked up from her laptop. You sure about this approach? We were sitting in my shop again, surrounded by evidence that could destroy my father's reputation and probably land him in federal prison. The smart play was to let the authorities handle everything through official channels. But I'd learned something about Frank over the years. He was smart enough to see official investigations coming. Smart enough to hide assets, relocate income, make problems disappear through the kind of connections that came with 20 years of being Kingston's self-proclaimed success story. An angry landlord demanding immediate answers. That was harder to charm your way out of. Bo Graves doesn't strike me as the patient type, I said. And Frank's been paying his rent with money from fraudulent loans. That makes Bo an unwitting accomplice. The email I'd sent contained everything. Copies of the forged LLC documents. The warehouse lease agreement Frank had never disclosed. Bank records showing systematic tax evasion. And most damning, a breakdown of how Frank had used his commercial lease as collateral for personal loans. My phone rang an hour later. Unknown number. This is Bo Graves. I want to meet. I told you I'd rather stay anonymous. And I'd rather look a man in the eye when he tells me I've been played for a fool. Coffee shop on Broadway. 1 hour. Bo Graves looked exactly like central casting would order for angry small-town landlord. Red face, work boots, hands that could crush walnuts. He was already seated when I walked into Murphy's Coffee, a manila folder open in front of him. You're Frank's boy, he said without preamble. I sat down across from him. How'd you know? Because you got his eyes, but not his bullshit. And because no one else would have access to these documents. He tapped the folder. Question is, why are you burning down your own family? Because my family's been burning down other families for years. I just didn't know it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bo studied me for a long moment. Your father and I go back 15 years. Gave him his first commercial lease when he was just starting out. Cut him breaks when he was short on rent. Hell, I co-signed a bank loan for him 3 years ago when he needed expansion capital. My stomach dropped. The warehouse loan, among others. Your father's got a gift for making people feel like they're part of something bigger. Like helping him succeed means you're building the community. Bo's voice turned bitter. Turns out I was just enabling a con man. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text exchange from that morning. Frank. Bo, we need to talk. Some disgruntled tenant is spreading lies about my business. Don't believe anything you hear until we sit down face to face. Bo, what lies? Frank. Tax problems that aren't really problems. Paperwork mix-ups that look worse than they are. You know how vindictive people get when you have to enforce lease terms. Bo, come by the office this afternoon. We'll sort this out. He thinks he can smooth talk his way out of this, Bo said. Same way he's been doing for years, but I've seen the documents you sent. There's no talking your way out of federal fraud charges. What are you going to do? Bo closed the folder and looked out the coffee shop window. Frank's office was visible 2 blocks away, the same building where he'd taken me as a kid to show me what real business looked like. I'm going to teach your father about consequences, real ones. That evening, I was closing up the shop when my phone started buzzing. Text from Mom. Frank got some bad news today. Can you call me? Then another. He won't tell me what's wrong, but he's been locked in his office for hours. Then a third. Elijah, please call. Something's very wrong. I didn't call. Instead, I drove past Frank's office building. His truck was still in the parking lot at 9 p.m., which was unusual. Frank liked to be home for dinner, liked to hold court at the head of the table while Mom served whatever she'd spent the afternoon cooking. But through the second-floor windows, I could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. The kind of agitated movement that said someone's world was falling apart one conversation at a time. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from Frank himself. Elijah, it's your father. I need to talk to you tonight. Some people are spreading lies about the business, and I think you should hear the truth directly from me. Come by the office when you get this. His voice sounded strained, older somehow. I deleted the voicemail without responding. The next morning, Rena met me at the shop with coffee and a grim expression. It started, she said, showing me her phone. Local Facebook group. Someone posted asking if anyone else has had problems with Monroe properties. Weird rent increases, maintenance issues, that kind of thing. I scrolled through the comments. 3 other tenants sharing similar stories to Denny Harper's, cash demands, threats of eviction, mysterious inspection violations that appeared whenever someone complained. How'd this get out? Bo Graves has a big mouth when he's angry, and apparently he's very angry. Rena pulled up another screen. Look at this. It was a legal notice posted in the Kingston Daily Freeman Classifieds. Notice of lease termination. Monroe Properties LLC is hereby notified that their commercial lease at 80 Fording Industrial Park Drive, terminated effective 30 days from this date, due to material breach of lease terms and fraudulent misrepresentation of financial status. All assets on the premises must be removed by November 15 or will be considered abandoned. Frank's headquarters, the building where he'd built his reputation as Kingston's premier small-time real estate mogul. Bo Graves was kicking him out. My phone rang. Mom again. This time I answered. Elijah. Her voice was shaky. Your father wants to know if you're free for dinner tonight. Family only. He says it's important. I looked around my shop, at the workbench where I repaired phones and refurbished laptops, at the small business that Frank had called a joke just 2 weeks ago. Tell him I'm busy, Mom. Tell him I'm building something Breaking into Frank's office wasn't really breaking in when you still had the spare key from 10 years ago. Back when I was 16, and sometimes helped him with weekend paperwork, filing invoices and organizing tenant complaints that he handled with the kind of personal attention that impressed people. I'd kept that key out of nostalgia, or maybe hope that someday we'd work together the way he always promised. Now it felt like evidence of how long I'd been naive. The building was empty at midnight on a Thursday. Frank's office occupied the second floor, and I'd watched from the parking lot until I was sure he'd gone home to whatever explanation he was giving Mom about his sudden lease termination. His desk looked like a hurricane had hit it, papers scattered everywhere, file drawers hanging open, the kind of chaos that comes from trying to find something important very quickly. But Frank had always been paranoid about really sensitive documents. The important stuff lived in a safe behind the framed photo of him shaking hands with the mayor at some ribbon-cutting ceremony. I'd watched him open that safe exactly once when I was 12 and he needed to retrieve the deed to our house for a refinancing application. His birthday backwards, then Mom's birthday, the combination still worked. Inside manila folders organized with the kind of obsessive care that Frank usually reserved for his public image, each folder labeled in his precise handwriting. Insurance, personal, insurance, commercial, tax returns, official, tax returns, backup, tax returns. That was interesting. I pulled out my phone and started recording. If I was going to do this, everything needed to be documented. The backup tax returns told a completely different story than the official ones: income from the warehouse rental property that never appeared on the IRS filings, deductions for business expenses that were actually personal purchases. Most damning, a systematic pattern of underreporting rental income while claiming maximum depreciation on properties that were generating far more revenue than he'd disclosed. But it was the insurance folder that made my hands shake. Claim forms, dozens of them, for properties I'd never heard of, including one that made my blood go cold. A duplex at 43 Oak Street, purchased 18 months ago through Monroe Holdings LLC, and insured under a policy that listed me as the primary owner. I'd never seen 43 Oak Street, never signed insurance paperwork, never agreed to own any property anywhere. But there was my signature on the insurance application, and on the property deed, and on a business loan application that used the duplex as collateral for $85,000 in expansion capital. Frank hadn't just forged my signature, he'd created an entire false identity for me as a real estate investor. I took pictures of everything, every forged document, every fraudulent claim, every piece of evidence that showed how deep this went. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and locked the safe. Walking out of that building, I felt something I hadn't expected: sadness, not anger, not vindication, just a profound sadness that this was who my father really was when no one was watching. The next morning, Rena found me sitting in my shop before opening time, staring at the photos on my phone. "How bad is it?" she asked, setting down coffee. I showed her the images, watched her face change as she scrolled through the evidence of systematic fraud spanning 3 years. "Jesus, Elijah. This isn't just tax evasion. This is identity theft on a massive scale." "I know. And insurance fraud, if he's filed claims on properties using your name." "I know." She sat down across from me. "Are you okay?" That was the question I'd been avoiding all night. Was I okay? Part of me had always known Frank was cutting corners. He'd bragged about it often enough: how smart landlords found ways around regulations, how you had to be creative to stay competitive. I'd told myself it was just business pragmatism, the kind of edge that successful people needed, but this wasn't edge. This was theft, from the government, from insurance companies, from me. He stole my identity to build his empire. I said quietly, "Everything he's accomplished for the last 3 years, it's all based on fraud committed in my name." Rena reached across and touched my hand. "We can stop this, you know, all of it. But once we turn over this evidence, he goes to prison, probably, and the properties get seized. The business collapses. Your mom loses everything too." I thought about Mom washing dishes while Frank held court at dinner parties, about her practiced smile when he humiliated me in front of guests, about 27 years of marriage to a man who'd just stolen her son's identity to fund his dreams. "My mom made her choice a long time ago," I said. "Every time she watched him tear me down and said nothing, every time she smoothed things over instead of calling him out, she chose him over the truth." Rena was quiet for a moment. "What about you? What are you choosing?" I looked around my shop, at the business I'd built without his help, despite his mockery, at the work he'd called a joke while he was literally stealing my name to fund his real estate schemes. "I'm choosing consequences," I said. "Real ones." That afternoon I called Sarah Collins and told her about the sale, about the forged insurance documents and the property I'd supposedly owned for 18 months. "This changes everything," she said. "We're not just talking about tax evasion anymore. This is federal identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud. If he's used your name to secure loans across state lines, how long would he go away for? With this much evidence, 10 years minimum. Maybe 15. I sat in my car outside Frank's office building, watching him through the second-floor windows. He was on the phone again, gesturing animated, probably trying to convince someone that this was all a misunderstanding, that Frank Monroe would never commit fraud because Frank Monroe was a pillar of the community. But I had pictures of his handwriting on forged documents, video of myself going through his safe, a digital trail that would hold up in any courtroom. My phone buzzed. Text from Mom. Your father wants to have lunch tomorrow, just the two of you. He says it's time for a real conversation. I typed back, tell him I'm ready for a real conversation too, just not the kind he's expecting. The video took 3 days to edit, not because it was technically complicated, just screen recordings of documents, audio from Denny Harper's testimony, timestamps showing the systematic nature of Frank's fraud. But every time I watched it, I was finalizing my father's destruction. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. That's all it took to demolish 20 years of reputation building. The opening shot, Frank's official tax return showing modest rental income of $118,000 for the previous year. Cut to bank records showing actual deposits of $67,000 in rental income. Cut to insurance claim for storm damage to a property that had no storm damage, featuring my forged signature as the property owner. Cut to audio of Frank threatening Denny Harper with eviction for not paying off the book's rent increase. Cut to a spreadsheet Rena had created, showing the systematic underreporting of income, the fraudulent use of my identity, the pattern of tenant intimidation. The final shot, a simple white screen with text reading Frank Monroe built his empire on fraud. These are the receipts. No narration, no dramatic music, just facts laid out with the kind of methodical precision that Frank had always told me real business required. Rena watched the final version with me in my shop after hours, both of us quiet until the screen went black. This will destroy him, she said. Good. I mean completely. Not just the business. His reputation, his marriage, his standing in the community, everything. I saved the video file and plugged in a USB drive. 20 years ago, my father chose to build his success on lies. 10 years ago, he chose to steal from tenants who trusted him. 3 years ago, he chose to commit identity theft using his own son's name. This week, he chose to humiliate me in front of a room full of people while sitting on evidence of federal crimes. The USB drive finished copying. I pulled it out and held it up. I'm not destroying Frank Monroe. I'm just showing people who he really is. Rena was quiet for a long moment. What about your mom? That was the question that had kept me up for 3 nights running. Maya Monroe wasn't innocent. She'd watched Frank's business practices for years without asking hard questions. But she wasn't the architect of this fraud either. I'm going to give her a choice, I said. Same choice she should have given me years ago. The next evening, I drove to my parents' house for what I knew would be the last time. Mom answered the door with that nervous smile that meant Frank had been talking. Elijah, I'm so glad you came. Your father's been looking forward to this conversation. Frank was waiting in his study, the same room where he'd taught me to read financial statements when I was 10, where he'd explained the difference between assets and liabilities, between building wealth and just earning money. The irony was suffocating. Son, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sit down, we need to talk. I sat, but I didn't set down the manila envelope I'd brought. I've been hearing some disturbing rumors, Frank continued. People spreading lies about the business, making accusations that could damage everything we've built. We? The family business, our reputation in this community. He leaned forward, using the tone that had convinced bank loan officers and city council members for 2 decades. I know you've been struggling with your little shop, and I know you might be tempted to listen to people who want to tear down successful men. But blood is thicker than water. Elijah, family stands together. I opened the manila envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, set it on his desk. It was a copy of the insurance application for the one with my forged signature claiming ownership of a property I'd never seen. Frank's face went white. Family stands together. I repeated, is that what you were thinking when you stole my identity to commit insurance fraud? Elijah? I can explain. Can you explain this? I pulled out the bank records showing unreported rental income. Or this, the audio transcript of his threats against Denny Harper. Or this, the loan application where he'd used my name as collateral for debt I'd never agreed to. Frank stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. How did you get these? The same way I got everything else, by paying attention, by asking questions, by treating evidence like it matters more than reputation. I stood up and pulled out the USB drive. This contains 3 years of documentation proving systematic tax evasion, identity theft, tenant intimidation, and insurance fraud. Tomorrow morning, copies go to the IRS, the FBI, the state attorney general, and every local news outlet that covers financial crime. Frank's hands were shaking. "You can't do this. You're my son. I'm your victim," I said quietly, "along with every tenant you've threatened, every agency you've defrauded, every person who trusted Frank Monroe to be the man he pretended to be." I walked to the door, then turned back. "You always said I'd never understand real business. Turns out I understand it better than you do. Real business doesn't require stealing from your own family." Mom was waiting in the hallway, tears in her eyes. She'd been listening. "Elijah," she whispered, "please don't do this. We can fix it. We can pay the money back." I pulled a second envelope from my jacket, handed it to her. "Divorce papers. Already filled out. All you have to do is sign and file. You've got 48 hours to decide if you want to go down with him or start over." Clean. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope. "He's my husband. He's a criminal who's been using your family as cover for federal crimes. You can choose to be his accomplice, or you can choose to be his victim. But you can't choose to be both." I walked out of that house and sat in my car for 5 minutes just breathing. My phone was already buzzing with the first automated responses from the anonymous email system I'd set up. The IRS had received my complaint at exactly 6:00 p.m. The FBI tip line would get their copy at 6:30, the state attorney general at 7:00, and at 8:00 a.m. tomorrow morning when Kingston woke up and checked their local news websites, they'd see a very different story about Frank Monroe than the one he'd been telling for 20 years. I started the car and drove toward my shop. Tomorrow, I'd start building something real on the ruins of everything Frank had stolen. The Kingston Business Development Mixer happened the third Thursday of every month at the Marriott Conference Center. Frank had been attending for 15 years, back when it was just coffee and donuts in the Chamber of Commerce basement. Now it was wine and networking, the kind of event where local success stories gave inspirational talks to younger entrepreneurs. Tonight, Frank Monroe was the featured speaker. The irony was so perfect I almost laughed. I'd bought a ticket that morning using a fake name and my old college email address. The theme was building sustainable local business, and according to the event listing, Frank would be sharing insights about responsible property management and community investment. I parked 3 blocks away and walked to the hotel, carrying a laptop bag that contained the most important presentation of my life. The conference room was packed. Maybe 60 people, small business owners, city council members, Chamber of Commerce types, the kind of crowd that had been applauding Frank's success story for 2 decades. I recognized half the faces from his dinner parties over the years. Frank stood at the front of the room in his best suit, the one he wore to church and funerals and occasions when he needed to look like someone other people should trust with their money. Behind him, a projection screen displayed the Monroe Properties logo and a tagline I'd never seen before: "Building Kingston's future, one home at a time." "Ladies and gentlemen," the chamber president began, "it's my pleasure to introduce a man who truly embodies the entrepreneurial spirit that makes our community strong." Frank Monroe started with nothing 20 years ago and built one of the most respected property management companies in the Hudson Valley. Please join me in welcoming Frank to share his insights on sustainable business growth. Applause filled the room. Frank smiled that practiced smile and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, Sharon. It's an honor to be here tonight." His voice carried that familiar authority, the tone that had convinced loan officers and tenants and city inspectors that Frank Monroe was exactly what he appeared to be. "When I started Monroe Properties," he continued, "I had one simple goal: to provide quality housing while building real value for our community. Tonight, I want to talk about the principles that have guided that growth." I found a seat in the back row and opened my laptop, connected to the hotel's guest Wi-Fi. Waited. "The first principle is integrity," Frank said. "Everything we do is built on honest relationships with our tenants, our partners, and our community. The projection system was running through the hotel's main network, the same network my laptop was now connected to. It had taken Rena 3 days to figure out how to access the presentation controls remotely, but she'd finally cracked it using a vulnerability in the conference center's outdated software. The second principle is transparency, Frank continued. Our tenants know exactly what they're paying for. Our investors know exactly how their money is being used. There are no hidden fees, no surprise charges, no undisclosed arrangements. I opened the video file I'd uploaded to a secure server. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of Frank's real business practices, ready to stream directly to the projection screen. The third principle is community responsibility. We don't just collect rent. We invest in the neighborhoods where we operate. We maintain our properties to standards that exceed city requirements. We work with tenants who face financial hardship instead of simply pursuing eviction. The audience was nodding along. I recognized Miss Henderson from the Methodist Church, the same woman who'd tried to disappear into her mashed potatoes during Frank's dinner party. Humiliation. She was taking notes. Frank clicked to advance his slide presentation. A photo of renovated apartments appeared behind him. These are the kinds of improvements we make when we invest in a property. Not just cosmetic changes, but real structural improvements that create lasting value. I knew those apartments. They were part of the warehouse complex Frank had purchased using my forged signature. The same complex where he'd been collecting undisclosed rental income for 8 months. Now I'd like to show you some specific examples of how responsible property management creates wins for everyone involved. Frank clicked his presentation remote again. Instead of his next slide, my video began playing. The first image, Frank's official tax return showing $18,000 in rental income. Frank stared at the screen in confusion, clicked his remote again. The image didn't change, cut to bank records showing actual deposits of $67,000. What the hell? Frank muttered, forgetting the microphone was still live. The room went quiet, 60 pairs of eyes turning from the screen to Frank and back again. Cut to the insurance claim with my forged signature. Frank lunged for the laptop controlling the presentation, but it was locked in a cabinet at the front of the room. He spun toward the projection booth, but the hotel AV tech just shrugged and pointed to his control board, which showed the signal was coming from an external source. Cut to audio transcript of Frank threatening Denny Harper with eviction. Someone in the audience gasped. I recognized the voice, Sarah Kim, who owned the flower shop downtown, one of Frank's tenants. Cut to the spreadsheet showing systematic income under reporting. Frank grabbed the microphone. This is a technical malfunction. Someone's hacked into the system. These documents are fake. They're... Cut to a close-up of Frank's handwriting on a rent demand letter. Compared to his signature on official lease documents, the handwriting was identical. The room erupted, not in applause, but in the kind of angry murmur that happens when people realize they've been lied to on a massive scale. Frank, Sharon called from the audience. What is this? The final shot. White screen with black text reading, Frank Monroe built his empire on fraud. These are the receipts. The video ended. The room went silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on Broadway. Frank stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand, staring at a projection screen that now displayed his company logo again, but the damage was done. 60 local business leaders had just watched 3 minutes of documented evidence that everything Frank Monroe had told them about integrity and transparency and community responsibility was a lie. I closed my laptop and stood up. Every head in the room turned toward me. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, loud enough to carry without a microphone, I'm Elijah Monroe, Frank's son, the one whose identity he stole to commit the fraud you just witnessed. Frank's face went from white to red, to something approaching purple. Elijah, don't do this. Not here. Why not here, Dad? This is where you built your reputation. Seems like the perfect place to show people what that reputation was really built on. I walked toward the exit, but Sharon stood up before I could reach the door. Wait, she called. Miss Monroe, Elijah, are you saying this evidence is legitimate? I turned back to face the room, 60 people who'd just watched their local success story exposed as a criminal. Some looked angry. Some looked confused. Most looked like they were trying to figure out which Monroe to believe. Every document in that video is authentic, I said. Every signature Frank forged is documented. Every threat he made is recorded. Every law he broke is backed up by evidence that's already been turned over to federal authorities. Frank dropped the microphone. The feedback screech made everyone wince. The FBI raid happens Monday morning, I continued. Property seizures start Tuesday. If you're one of his tenants, you might want to start looking for new housing. If you're one of his investors, you might want to call your lawyer. I walked out of that conference room and didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear the explosion, voices rising, chairs scraping, someone calling for hotel security. My phone was already buzzing with notifications. The video had automatically uploaded to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter the moment it finished playing. Frank Monroe fraud was trending locally within 20 minutes. I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot and watched Frank's world implode in real time through social media posts and angry comments, and news outlets picking up the story. 20 years of reputation building, destroyed in 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I started the engine and drove home, wondering why victory felt so much like grief. Uncle Randy showed up at my shop the next morning, carrying a gym bag and wearing the kind of smile that meant someone was about to get their comeuppance. I hadn't seen Randy Monroe in 5 years. Frank's younger brother, the family black sheep who'd supposedly wasted his potential on drinking and bad investments. The cautionary tale Frank used to explain why some people succeeded and others didn't. Hell of a show last night, Randy said, setting the gym bag on my counter. Watched it 3 times on YouTube already. How'd you find me, kid? Half the town knows where Elijah Monroe's tech shop is, especially after you nuked your father's reputation in front of 60 witnesses. Randy unzipped the bag. Question is, are you ready for the nuclear option? Inside the bag, file folders, bank statements, and what looked like 20 years' worth of business correspondence. What is this? Everything Frank thought he destroyed when he cut me out of the family business. Randy's smile turned predatory. See? Your father made one mistake when he decided I was too much of a liability to work with. He assumed I was too drunk to keep records. I pulled out the first folder. It contained contracts for construction work on Frank's early rental property. But the invoices were strange. Payments to companies I'd never heard of for work that seemed inflated. Monroe Construction Solutions, Randy explained. Monroe Property Services, Monroe Maintenance LLC, all shell companies, all owned by Frank. He'd bill himself for imaginary construction work, then claim the expenses as tax deductions, while pocketing the money as profit. The scope was breathtaking. For 15 years, Frank had been creating fake subcontractors to justify inflated renovation costs. He'd bill Monroe Properties $50,000 for a kitchen renovation that actually cost $15,000, then pocket the difference while claiming the full amount as a business expense. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate, about $400,000 in fraudulent tax deductions over the last decade. Randy pulled out another folder, but that's not the best part. The second folder contained bank records showing regular transfers from Monroe Properties to something called Patriot Investment Holdings. The same company I'd discovered was renting the warehouse from Frank's LLC. Money laundering, Randy said simply. Frank creates fake construction expenses, transfers the money to shell companies, then uses those companies to rent property from himself. Clean money in, clean money out, with tax deductions on both ends. I sat down heavily in my customer chair. Jesus, Randy, this is federal conspiracy. Gets better. Or worse, depending on your perspective. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. Remember when Frank got that big loan to expand into commercial properties? The one that let him buy the warehouse and those apartments on Elm Street? I nodded. Loan application claimed he had a construction partner with 20 years of experience and a spotless credit history. Someone who'd co-sign for the full amount and provide additional collateral if needed. Randy opened the envelope and showed me the loan documents. The cosigner was listed as Randall Monroe, with my uncle's social security number, credit history, and forged signature. He stole your identity too? Oh, it gets worse. Look at the collateral listed. I scanned the documents. Frank had used Randy's house as collateral for the loan. The same house Randy had inherited from their parents. The house Frank had supposedly helped Randy sell to pay off gambling debts. He never sold your house? Nope. Transferred the deed to one of his shell companies, then used it as loan collateral. Far as the bank knows, I willingly put up my family home to help my brother's business expansion. Randy's voice was bitter. I've been living in a rented trailer for 3 years while Frank collected rental income from my own fucking house. The magnitude of Frank's fraud was staggering. He hadn't just stolen from tenants and government agency, he'd systematically robbed his own family to fund an empire built on completely fictional foundations. Why didn't you report this before? Randy laughed, but there was no humor in it. Report it to who? Frank Monroe, pillar of the community, the man who throws money at the police benevolent fund and sits on the planning commission. The guy whose word carries weight with every bank president and city councilman in Kingston. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text message thread. Randy, Frank, we need to talk about the house. Frank. What house? You sold that place to pay your debts. Remember, Randy, I never sold anything. You forged my signature. Frank. Randy, you were drunk for most of 2019. Maybe you don't remember signing the papers. Randy, I have copies of everything. Frank, copies of what? Your fantasy. Get help, little brother. He's been gaslighting me for 3 years, Randy said, making everyone think I'm a delusional drunk who can't keep his story straight. But I kept every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence. I looked at the pile of evidence Randy had brought. Combined with what I'd already gathered, we had enough documentation to put Frank away for decades. Randy, this is going to destroy the entire family legacy. Everything our grandfather built, everything Frank's accomplished. Good, Randy interrupted. You know what our grandfather built? A small construction company that did honest work for fair pay. You know what Frank built? A criminal enterprise that happens to own real estate. He zipped up the gym bag, but left the most damning documents on my counter. I've got copies of everything at a safety deposit box in Albany, and before you ask, yes, I'm willing to testify. I've been waiting 5 years for someone to take Frank down. My phone buzzed. Text from Rena, just saw the news. FBI scheduled a press conference for Monday morning. This is really happening. I looked at Randy. Are you sure about this? Once I turn over your evidence, there's no taking it back. Kid, Frank, stole my house, my inheritance, and my reputation. He turned me into the family failure to cover his own crimes. The only question is whether you're ready to finish what you started. I thought about Frank standing in that conference room last night, watching his world collapse in real time. About the fraud that went back not 3 years, but 15. About Uncle Randy living in a trailer while Frank collected rent on property he'd stolen. I'm ready, Randy nodded and headed for the door. One more thing, Elijah. That money Frank's been bragging about donating to local charities. The contributions that got him recognition from the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce. What about it? Check the bank records in that folder. Frank's been claiming tax deductions for charitable donations, but the money never left his accounts. He's been writing off imaginary gifts to fake charities for 5 years. The door chimed as Randy left. I sat alone in my shop, surrounded by evidence that would end not just Frank's freedom, but any possibility that the Monroe name would mean anything positive in Kingston ever again. My phone rang. Mom's number. I answered. Elijah? Her voice was shaky. Your father's been arrested. They'd taken Frank at 6 a.m. while he was getting coffee at the Dunkin' Donuts on Broadway. Two FBI agents in suits, reading him his rights while the morning commuters watched through the window. Mom called me from the police station parking lot, her voice hollow with shock. They won't let me see him. They say he's being processed for federal charges. Elijah, what did you do? I was already in my car, driving toward the center of town where Frank had spent 20 years building his reputation. Now FBI vehicles lined the street outside his office building, and a local news van was setting up for what would probably be the biggest story Kingston had seen in decades. I didn't do anything, Mom. I just stopped pretending Frank was innocent. He's your father. He's a criminal who's been using our family as cover for fraud. I pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Coffee, the same place where I'd met Beau Graves a week ago. Where are you now? Home. I don't know what to do. They gave me a card for a federal prosecutor. Said I might need a lawyer too. That stopped me cold. Why would you need a lawyer? Silence on the other end. Then, quietly, because my name is on some of the business accounts. The ones Frank used for the shell companies. Maya Monroe wasn't just Frank's wife. She was his unwitting accomplice, her signature on documents she'd never read for companies she'd never heard of. Another layer of his fraud that I hadn't anticipated. Mom, you need to call that prosecutor today. Tell them you want to cooperate. Tell them everything you know about Frank's business practices. I can't testify against my own husband. You can testify for yourself, and for every tenant Frank threatened, and for Uncle Randy, whose house Frank stole, and for me, whose identity he's been using to commit federal crime. I hung up and sat in the parking lot watching the FBI investigators carry boxes out of Frank's office building. 3 years of evidence, being loaded into government vehicles that would transport it to federal facilities where prosecutors would build the case that would send my father to prison. My phone buzzed with notifications. The Kingston Daily Freeman had posted the story online. Local real estate developer arrested on federal fraud charge. The comments section was already exploding with former tenants sharing their own stories of off-books rent increases and intimidation tactics. Another notification: missed call from Sarah Collins, the lawyer who'd helped us prepare the whistleblower complaint. I called her back. Elijah, I just got off the phone with the federal prosecutor's office. They want to meet with you this afternoon. About what? About your cooperation, and about whether you want immunity in exchange for your testimony. Immunity from what? Your name is on a lot of business documents. Even if the signatures are forged, you're technically listed as a partner in several LLCs that committed tax fraud. The prosecutors want to make sure you're a witness, not a defendant. The implications hit me like cold water. Frank hadn't just stolen my identity. He'd made me legally liable for his crimes. What do I need to do? Tell them everything about the forged signatures, the identity theft, the fraud you uncovered. Convince them you're a victim, not a co-conspirator. I spent the afternoon in a federal building in Albany, sitting across a conference table from two prosecutors, who looked like they'd stepped out of a legal drama. Agent Sarah Kim asked questions while Agent David Park took notes, and I answered with the kind of detail that comes from having your entire family destroyed by systematic fraud. When did you first become aware that your father was using your identity for business purposes? Agent Kim asked. 3 weeks ago, when I found loan documents with my forged signature. And you never received any income from Monroe Holdings LLC. I never even knew Monroe Holdings existed until I started investigating my father's business practices. What prompted that investigation? I thought about the dinner party, about Frank calling my business a joke while sitting on evidence of federal crimes committed in my name. He humiliated me publicly one too many times. I decided to see if his success was as legitimate as he claimed. Agent Park looked up from his notes. Mr. Monroe, your cooperation has been invaluable to this investigation. The evidence you've provided documents one of the most extensive real estate fraud schemes we've seen in this region. What happens now? Your father will likely be charged with tax evasion, identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. If convicted on all counts, He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. And my mother, that depends on her level of cooperation. If she can demonstrate that she was an unwitting victim of your father's fraud, she'll probably avoid prosecution. I drove home from Albany, as the sun was setting over the Hudson Valley. The same landscape where Frank had built his empire of lies, where he'd convinced an entire community that Frank Monroe was someone worth respecting. My phone rang as I pulled into the parking lot behind my shop. Unknown number. Is this Elijah Monroe? Yeah. This is Judge Marta Callahan. I've been following your father's case. I wanted you to know that tomorrow morning, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing Frank from contacting you or accessing any property connected to Monroe Holdings LLC. Why are you calling me directly? Because 20 years ago, I watched a young man named Frank Monroe convince this entire town that he was building something legitimate. And because 3 weeks ago, I watched his son risk everything to prove that success built on fraud isn't success at all. I sat in my car after she hung up, looking at my shop through the window. The small business Frank had called a joke. The work he'd dismissed as not real enough for a Monroe. Tomorrow the newspapers would run stories about Frank's arrest. The FBI investigation would expand to include his shell companies and money laundering schemes. Uncle Randy would get his house back, and Denny Harper would never have to pay off-books rent again. But tonight, I was just a 26-year-old tech repair shop owner, whose father had chosen crime over family, reputation over integrity, control over respect. My phone buzzed with a text from Raina. Saw the news. Are you okay? I typed back, getting there. Want to help me figure out what comes next? Always. I got out of my car and unlocked my shop. Tomorrow, I'd start building something new on the ruins of everything Frank had destroyed. Tonight, I'd just sit in the quiet and let myself feel something I hadn't experienced in years. 6 weeks later, I stood in the warehouse that used to be Frank's crown jewel, watching Raina measure wall space for workbenches. The federal government had seized all of Monroe Properties' assets, but the court had fast-tracked the return of properties purchased with my forged signature. Turns out judges don't like identity theft, especially when it's committed by fathers against their own children. The warehouse was mine now, legally, legitimately mine, along with the headaches of figuring out what to do with 8,000 square feet of industrial space and a monthly overhead that would have terrified me 6 months ago. Workshop space here, Raina said, pointing to the north wall. Retail and customer service over there. Office space upstairs. If we're really doing this, we need to think bigger than just tech repair. We were doing this, whatever this turned out to be. The idea had started during a conversation with Denny Harper, who'd stopped by my shop the week after Frank's arrest. He'd been carrying a broken tablet and wearing the kind of smile that meant his world had gotten significantly less stressful. No more cash demands, he'd said, setting the tablet on my counter. New management company took over all of Frank's property, legitimate lease agreements, reasonable rent, actual maintenance when things break. It's like living in civilization again. But then he'd mentioned something that stuck with me. You know, there's a lot of folks like me in this town. People trying to make small businesses work without much capital. People who got good ideas but not much support. Your father spent 20 years convincing everyone that only certain kinds of businesses were worth investing in. That's when it clicked. Frank had been wrong about everything, but he'd been especially wrong about what constituted real business. The warehouse was perfect for what I had in mind. Space for tech repair and refurbishment, but also room for other joke businesses that needed affordable works. The woman who made jewelry from her kitchen table, the guy who fixed bicycles in his garage, the teenager who'd started a 3D printing service but couldn't afford commercial rent. Kingston Tech Collective, that's what we were calling it. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Collins. Federal sentencing hearing scheduled for December 15th. Prosecutors recommending 18 years. Are you planning to give a victim impact statement? I'd been thinking about that for weeks. What do you say about a father who stole your identity to commit federal crimes? How do you explain the relief of watching someone get exactly the consequences they'd spent years avoiding? I typed back, yes, I'll be there. The bell above the warehouse door chimed. I'd installed it myself, a small touch that made the cavernous space feel more like an actual business. Uncle Randy walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that comes with getting your house back. "How's the empire coming along?" he asked, handing me one of the cups. "Slowly. Turns out legitimate business is harder than fraud," Randy laughed, "but more sustainable. Speaking of which, I got news from the prosecutor's office. Frank's cooperating now, giving up names of other landlords who were running similar schemes." "Other landlords? Apparently your father wasn't the only one in the Hudson Valley using shell companies and off-books rent increases. He was just the one who got caught." Randy walked over to where Rena was still measuring wall space. "FBI thinks this investigation could expand to cover dozens of properties and hundreds of tenants." The scope kept growing. What had started as my personal rebellion against family humiliation had become the thread that unraveled an entire network of rental property fraud. "Any word on Mom?" Randy's expression softened. "She's doing better. Enrolled in those accounting classes at the community college. Says she wants to understand business finances so she never gets used like that again." Maya Monroe had filed for divorce 3 days after Frank's arrest. She'd moved into a small apartment near downtown Kingston and taken a part-time job at the library. For the first time in 27 years, she was making decisions without asking Frank's permission. She'd only called me once since the arrest, to apologize for not protecting me from Frank's fraud, and to ask if I thought we could have a relationship that didn't involve him. I'd said yes, cautiously, carefully, but yes. "Elijah," Rena called from across the warehouse. "Come look at this." She was standing by the loading dock, holding a thick manila envelope that had been slipped under the door. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside, a letter and a cashier's check for $50,000. "Dear Mr. Monroe, my name is David Chen. I was one of your father's tenants for 3 years before the FBI investigation. Like many others, I was paying off-books rent increases and living under constant threat of eviction for violations that only appeared when I couldn't pay extra money. I've been following the news about your new business venture. The idea of supporting legitimate small businesses instead of exploiting them appeals to me greatly. The enclosed check represents the money I overpaid in fraudulent rent increases over 3 years. I would like to invest it in your tech collective. If you're interested in partners who understand the difference between real business and criminal enterprise. Respectfully, David Chen. P.S. I run a small accounting service from my home. If you need help setting up legitimate business books, I'd be honored to assist." I stared at the check. More money than I'd ever held at one time. Enough to fully outfit the warehouse, hire part-time help, maybe even offer small loans to other entrepreneurs who couldn't get traditional bank financing. "Holy shit," Rena said, reading over my shoulder. "This is really happening." My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Mr. Monroe? This is Agent Kim from the FBI. I have an unusual request." "What kind of request?" "We're getting calls from fraud victims in other counties. People who've heard about your case and want to report similar schemes by their landlords. Would you be willing to serve as a liaison? Help us identify patterns and connect victims with resources." I looked around the warehouse, at Rena mapping out workspace configuration, at Uncle Randy examining the electrical systems, at the letter from David Chen offering to invest his stolen money in something legitimate. "Agent Kim, I think I can do better than serve as a liaison. What if we created a resource center? Somewhere fraud victims could get help, and legitimate small businesses could get support. That's not typically how federal investigations work, but it's how real community building works, and I'm pretty sure that's what my father never understood." After I hung up, I walked to the center of the warehouse and stood in the space that would become the main workshop area. 6 weeks ago, I'd been the family disappointment, running a joke business that would never amount to anything real. Now I owned property that had been purchased with fraud, but I was turning it into something that might actually help people build legitimate success. The irony was perfect. Frank had spent 20 years stealing from the community to build his fake empire. I was going to spend the next 20 years helping the community build real businesses with the resources he'd left behind. My phone buzzed with one final notification of the day, an email from the Kingston Daily Freeman. Subject: follow-up interview request. Miss Monroe, we'd like to do a feature story on the Kingston Tech Collective and your work helping fraud victims rebuild. Would you be available for an interview this week? We're particularly interested in your perspective on what constitutes legitimate business success versus the kind of reputation building that hides criminal activity. I started typing my response. I'd be happy to talk about building something real. Outside, the sun was setting over Kingston, painting the warehouse windows gold. Tomorrow, Rena and I would meet with David Chen about his investment proposal. Uncle Randy would help me install proper electrical outlets for the workspace area. And somewhere in federal custody, Frank Monroe would sit in a cell thinking about the 18-year sentence he'd earned by choosing fraud over family. But tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't the disappointment, I was the foundation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.